The autumn storm lashed against the towering walls of Blackmore Castle, with a fury that seemed to echo the cruelty unfolding within its opulent halls. Inside the grand reception chamber, Prince Dorian Blackmore stood like an avenging god of aristocratic justice, his emerald eyes blazing with cold satisfaction as he pronounced sentence upon the trembling young woman who knelt before him on the Persian carpet. "How dare to come before me with such preposterous claims?" His voice cut through the room like a blade, forged in privilege and sharpened by generations of absolute power. "You? A common nobody from God knows where, seeking to deceive me with tales of stolen inheritance and noble birth?" Evangeline Ashford remained on her knees, despite every instinct screaming at her to flee, her sapphire eyes fixed upon the intricate patterns beneath her as she struggled to maintain what remained of her composure. At 23, she had endured 18 months of degradation and loss that had taught her the bitter truth about how quickly fortune could abandon those who lacked the power to defend themselves. "Your Highness," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm raging outside, "I speak only the truth. My father was Lord William Ashford of Ravenshollow, and the documents proving my inheritance were conveniently destroyed in a fire, leaving only your word to support these extraordinary claims." Prince Dorian interrupted with theatrical disdain. "How remarkably convenient that every piece of evidence supporting your supposed noble birth has vanished, leaving us with nothing but the testimony of a desperate woman willing to say anything to escape her properly lowly circumstances." Around the reception chamber, courtiers and visiting dignitaries watched the proceedings with the morbid fascination that the privileged always displayed when witnessing the destruction of someone defenseless. The young woman's obvious desperation and the prince's cruel certainty in dismissing her claims provided exactly the sort of entertainment that made such gatherings memorable. Lady Cordelia Whitmore, the prince's current favourite among the court ladies, tittered behind her fan with practiced cruelty. "Really, Your Highness, one must admire her audacity. To think that simply claiming noble blood would grant her access to your gracious consideration. The presumption is quite breathtaking." "Indeed it is," Prince Dorian agreed with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Though I confess myself curious about what desperate circumstances drove her to attempt such an elaborate deception. Tell me, miss, what did you say your name was again?" "Evangeline Ashford, Your Highness," she replied quietly, though her voice carried an undertone of dignity that had survived even the systematic destruction of everything she had once held dear. "Miss Ashford," the prince repeated with mock solemnity. Such a grand name for someone whose appearance suggests considerably more humble origins. "Your dress, while clean, is clearly the work of a village seamstress rather than any fashionable modiste. Your hands bear the calluses of someone accustomed to manual labor rather than the soft smoothness one expects from true nobility." Each observation fell like a blow designed to strip away whatever remained of her carefully maintained self-respect. Prince Dorian had perfected the art of destroying people through systematic humiliation, using his keen intelligence and vast resources to identify and exploit every vulnerability his victims possessed. "Furthermore," he continued with growing satisfaction at his own cleverness, "your manner of speech, while educated, lacks the subtle intonations that mark those truly born to privilege. You have clearly studied how to speak like nobility, but you cannot quite conceal the fundamental truth of your origins." Evangeline's hands clenched into fists as she struggled against the crushing weight of his accusations. Everything he said contained enough truth to be devastating. She had indeed worked as a seamstress's assistant to survive after her family's destruction. Her hands did bear calluses from honest labor, and months of poverty had taught her to speak carefully to avoid revealing the full extent of her reduced circumstances. But the fundamental truth she carried in her heart remained unchanged despite every appearance to the contrary. She was indeed Lady Evangeline Ashford, daughter of one of England's oldest families, and the documents that would prove her identity had not been destroyed in any convenient fire, but stolen by the very people who had orchestrated her family's downfall. "Your Highness," she tried once more, desperation lending strength to her voice, "if you would only allow me to explain the circumstances that led to my family's destruction, the conspiracy that was mounted against my father's reputation." "A conspiracy?" Prince Dorian's laugh rang through the chamber like breaking glass. "Of course there was a conspiracy. There is always a conspiracy when people of humble origins attempt to explain away their natural circumstances. Tell me, Miss Ashford, who were these mysterious conspirators who supposedly targeted your supposedly noble family?" The question was delivered with such crushing sarcasm that several courtiers joined in the prince's laughter, adding their own cruel amusement to the systematic destruction of Evangeline's last hope for justice and restoration. But Evangeline raised her sapphire eyes to meet Prince Dorian's emerald gaze directly, and for a moment something flickered between them, a recognition that neither quite understood, but that would prove far more significant than either could have imagined. "The conspiracy was led by Lord Marcus Thorne," she said, with quiet conviction that silenced the laughter instantly. "He sought to acquire my father's estates through manufactured evidence of treason, forged documents that suggested my father was selling military secrets to French agents." The name she had spoken sent a visible chill through the assembled company, because Lord Marcus Thorne was not some convenient fiction, but a real and powerful figure whose political influence extended across multiple kingdoms. More importantly, he was a man known for his ruthless elimination of obstacles to his ambitions. Prince Dorian's expression shifted subtly as he processed the implications of Evangeline's accusation. If she was indeed fabricating her story, naming someone as dangerous as Lord Thorne represented either extraordinary stupidity or desperate honesty. "You accuse Lord Thorne of conspiracy and forgery," the prince said with dangerous quiet. "These are serious allegations that could be considered treasonous if made without substantial proof." "They are serious allegations because the crimes they describe are equally serious," Evangeline replied with courage, born of having nothing left to lose. "Lord Thorne orchestrated my father's disgrace and death to acquire estates that bordered his own holdings. When my father died in prison before he could expose the truth, Lord Thorne seized our lands through legal mechanisms that his political influence made unassailable." The detailed nature of her accusations, combined with her unwavering direct gaze, was beginning to plant seeds of doubt in Prince Dorian's mind. Women attempting to deceive their way into higher social positions typically chose safer targets than one of the realm's most powerful and vindictive lords. "And what precisely do you expect me to do with these accusations?" Prince Dorian asked with cold curiosity. "Even if they were true, which I find highly doubtful, Lord Thorne's political connections make him virtually untouchable through normal legal channels." "I expect nothing, Your Highness," Evangeline said with heartbreaking dignity. "I came here not seeking your intervention, but hoping that your reputation for intelligence and justice might move you to investigate claims that could easily be verified through careful examination of the evidence." The appeal to his intelligence was perfectly calculated to penetrate the prince's arrogance, suggesting that his rejection of her claims might reflect intellectual failure rather than superior judgment. "Evidence which you claim was destroyed," Prince Dorian pointed out with returning skepticism. "Evidence which Lord Thorne believes was destroyed," Evangeline corrected with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the conspiracy she described. "But certain documents were hidden before his agents could locate them, and witnesses exist who can testify to the truth of what occurred." Prince Dorian studied her face with the intensity of someone whose political survival had taught him to detect deception with remarkable accuracy. What he saw there was not the shifting uncertainty of a fabricated story, but the steady conviction of someone speaking truth, regardless of its reception. "Your Highness," Lord Pemberton, one of the prince's advisers, interjected with obvious concern, "surely these wild accusations have been given sufficient hearing. Perhaps it would be best to conclude this interview before it attracts unwanted attention from those who might misinterpret your patience with such claims." The suggestion that Prince Dorian's consideration of Evangeline's story might be politically dangerous revealed the fear that Lord Thorne's name inspired even among the highest circles of power. But the prince's emerald eyes remained fixed upon Evangeline's face as he wrestled with instincts that suggested something about her story rang true despite its apparent impossibility. "Miss Ashford," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity, "what do you believe gives you the right to stand before me and make accusations against one of the realm's most powerful lords?" "Nothing gives me that right, Your Highness," Evangeline replied with quiet honesty. "I have no power, no influence, no protection from the consequences of speaking truth. I came here because truth deserves to be spoken even when it cannot be defended." The answer revealed a moral courage that Prince Dorian, despite his cynicism and cruelty, could not help but recognize and respect. She was not claiming rights, but acknowledging their absence, while maintaining her commitment to honesty, regardless of personal cost. But before he could formulate a response, the chamber doors burst open to admit a messenger, bearing news that would transform the evening's entertainment into something far more dangerous and significant than anyone present could have anticipated. The messenger who entered the reception chamber wore the dark livery of urgent royal business, his mud-splattered uniform speaking of a desperate ride through the storm that still raged outside Blackmore Castle. His appearance immediately commanded attention from every person present, as such interruptions were reserved for matters of the highest importance that brooked no delay for social convenience. "Your Highness," the messenger announced with formal precision, despite his obvious exhaustion, "I bear urgent communications from the capital regarding Lord Marcus Thorne. His Majesty commands immediate investigation of serious allegations that have come to light concerning fraudulent seizure of noble estates." The words struck the reception chamber like lightning, illuminating Evangeline's accusations in a completely different context, while sending visible shockwaves through the assembled courtiers. The timing was so extraordinary that several guests exchanged glances of amazement at the coincidence. Prince Dorian's emerald eyes snapped back to Evangeline with laser intensity as he began to reassess everything about her presence and claims in light of this remarkable development. "Continue," he commanded the messenger with dangerous quiet. "Your Majesty has received evidence suggesting that Lord Thorne has systematically targeted noble families for destruction through fabricated charges of treason, seizing their estates through legal mechanisms supported by forged documents and perjured testimony," the messenger continued, consulting official papers that bore the royal seal. Each word fell like a hammer blow, confirming the essential truth of everything Evangeline had claimed just moments earlier. Around the chamber, expressions of skeptical amusement transformed into fascinated attention as they realized they might be witnessing historical vindication of extraordinary accusations. "Furthermore," the messenger announced, "His Majesty specifically requests information regarding the whereabouts of Lady Evangeline Ashford, daughter of the late Lord William Ashford, whose family appears to have been among Lord Thorne's earliest victims." The formal use of Evangeline's title sent gasps echoing through the reception chamber as the assembled company realized that the young woman they had been watching Prince Dorian humiliate was indeed exactly who she had claimed to be, a legitimate member of the nobility, whose family had been destroyed through the very conspiracy she had described. Evangeline felt her knees buckle with relief as royal authority finally acknowledged her true identity and her father's innocence. The vindication she had dreamed of during 18 months of poverty and degradation was unfolding before the very people who had dismissed her claims as desperate deception. Prince Dorian stood frozen as the implications of the evening's events crashed over him like an avalanche. The woman he had been systematically humiliating for his courtiers' entertainment was revealed as someone whose accusations had been vindicated by royal investigation, whose noble birth was confirmed by the highest authority in the realm. "Lady Evangeline," he said slowly, using her proper title for the first time and causing her to raise her sapphire eyes to meet his uncertain gaze, "it appears that your allegations have received unexpected corroboration." The careful phrasing revealed his struggle to process the complete reversal of the evening's dynamics, without acknowledging the full extent of his error in judgment and treatment of someone under royal protection. "Your Highness," the messenger continued with remorseless precision, "His Majesty also wishes to express particular displeasure with any persons who may have dismissed or mistreated Lady Evangeline during her time of vulnerability. Such treatment of nobility under false accusation is considered a grave offense against royal justice." The threat hung in the air like a sword suspended over everyone who had participated in Evangeline's humiliation, from Prince Dorian himself to the courtiers who had laughed at her supposed presumption in claiming noble birth. Lady Cordelia Whitmore's face had gone white as parchment, as she realized that her cruel mockery of Evangeline's claims had been witnessed by dozens of people who could testify to her participation in the systematic persecution of someone under royal protection. Moreover, the messenger announced, consulting a second document, "Lord Thorne has fled the realm upon learning of the investigation into his activities. His hasty departure has been interpreted as confirmation of guilt, and his estates have been placed under royal seizure pending complete accounting of his crimes." The news of Lord Thorne's flight sent electric excitement through the chamber as they realized they were witnessing not just vindication of individual accusations, but the fall of one of the kingdom's most powerful and feared political figures. Prince Dorian's mind raced as he attempted to calculate the political implications of the evening's revelations. His treatment of Lady Evangeline would be reported to the king, along with news of her recovery, and royal displeasure with those who had mistreated her could have catastrophic consequences for his own position and influence. "Lady Evangeline," he said with careful formality that attempted to disguise his growing panic, "please accept my profound regrets for any misunderstanding that may have occurred regarding your identity and circumstances. Had I understood your true position, you would have treated me with the courtesy due to my rank rather than basic human decency," Evangeline interrupted quietly, her voice carrying an edge that revealed the depth of hurt his cruelty had inflicted, despite her eventual vindication. The observation struck Prince Dorian like a physical blow because it forced him to confront the ugly truth about his own character, that his treatment of others was determined entirely by their perceived power to retaliate, rather than any inherent worth they possessed as human beings. Furthermore, Evangeline continued with growing strength as royal acknowledgement restored her confidence and authority, "Your rejection of my claims was based not on careful investigation, but on prejudice against anyone who lacked the appearance of wealth and power." Around the chamber, courtiers who had participated in her humiliation began to edge toward the exits as they contemplated their own exposure to royal displeasure for their treatment of someone now revealed to be under the king's explicit protection. "Your Highness," the messenger interjected with diplomatic precision, "His Majesty has instructed me to escort Lady Evangeline to the capital immediately, where physicians await to tend her health and lawyers stand ready to pursue restitution for the wrongs she has endured." The offer of immediate royal protection and guaranteed justice was exactly what Evangeline had dreamed of during her months of exile and suffering, but she found herself hesitating as she looked at Prince Dorian's increasingly desperate expression. "There is additional news," the messenger continued, "that bears directly upon tonight's proceedings. His Majesty has received reports that Lord Thorn dispatched agents to eliminate Lady Evangeline before she could expose his conspiracy. Her safety has been a matter of royal concern for some time. The revelation that she had been in actual physical danger from Lord Thorn's assassins transformed the evening's confrontation from social drama to matters of life and death. Prince Dorian realized with growing horror that his rejection of her claims and impending dismissal of her into the storm might have delivered her directly into the hands of those seeking to kill her. "Lady Evangeline," he said desperately, "surely you understand that my earlier skepticism was merely appropriate caution regarding extraordinary claims. I never intended any actual harm. Did you not?" Evangeline's sapphire eyes fixed upon him with laser intensity. "You intended to cast me out into the storm without shelter, without protection, without any concern for my survival. Whether or not you knew of Lord Thorn's agents, your indifference to my fate could easily have achieved their purposes." The accusation was devastating in its accuracy, forcing Prince Dorian to confront the casual cruelty with which he had been prepared to dispose of someone whose only crime was seeking justice for her murdered father and destroyed family. But before he could formulate any response that might mitigate his culpability, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the storm outside, followed by urgent hammering upon the castle's main gates. "Your Highness," called the captain of the guard from the courtyard below, "armed riders approach under Lord Thorn's banner. They demand surrender of a fugitive claimed to be harbored within these walls." The arrival of Lord Thorn's agents at this precise moment sent shockwaves of terror through the reception chamber, as everyone realized that the conspiracy Evangeline had described was still actively pursuing her elimination. Prince Dorian's face went white as he understood that his castle was about to become a battlefield between royal justice and treasonous conspiracy, with Lady Evangeline as the prize whose capture or protection would determine the outcome. "Lady Evangeline," the royal messenger said with urgent authority, "we must depart immediately through the private passages. Lord Thorn's men cannot be allowed to prevent your testimony from reaching His Majesty." But as the messenger moved to escort Evangeline towards safety, Prince Dorian found himself faced with a choice that would define not only his own character, but the very meaning of noble responsibility when tested by genuine crisis. He could allow her departure and hope that royal gratitude would protect him from consequences of his earlier cruelty, or he could choose to actively defend someone he had wronged against enemies whose defeat would require personal courage rather than mere political calculation. The decision would reveal whether 18 months of suffering had been enough to transform Evangeline's persecutor into her protector, or whether the habits of cruelty and self-interest would prove stronger than the possibility of redemption through genuine courage. The sound of steel being drawn from scabbards rang through the courtyard below as Lord Thorne's agents prepared for what they clearly expected to be a simple extraction of an unprotected fugitive. Their leader's voice carried clearly through the storm as he announced their demands with the confidence of men who had never been refused. "Prince Dorian," the agent called from beyond the gates, "we know you harbor the traitor's daughter within these walls. Surrender her immediately, or face the consequences of protecting enemies of the crown." The accusation of harboring enemies struck Prince Dorian like a physical blow, because he realized that Lord Thorne's men were using the very conspiracy that had destroyed Evangeline's family to justify her capture and elimination. The innocent were being labeled as traitors, while the actual traitors claimed the authority of justice. "Your Highness," Captain Morrison of the Castle Guard appeared in the doorway with obvious concern. "They number at least 20 armed men, and they're moving to surround the castle. If they're truly here on royal business, we have no legal grounds to resist their demands." The captain's observation revealed the elegant trap that Lord Thorne's conspiracy had constructed. By framing their victims as traitors, they could claim royal authority for actions that served their personal interests while eliminating anyone who might expose their crimes. Prince Dorian looked at Evangeline, who stood with quiet dignity despite the terror that must be coursing through her veins at the approach of those who had spent months hunting her. The royal messenger waited beside her, clearly prepared to spirit her away through whatever escape routes the castle possessed. "Lady Evangeline," Prince Dorian said with careful formality, "you are of course free to depart with His Majesty's representative. I have no authority to detain someone under royal protection." The words were perfectly correct and politically safe, acknowledging her status, while avoiding any personal commitment to her defense that might prove costly if Lord Thorne's agents possessed superior force. But as Evangeline turned toward the messenger, preparing to accept the escape that royal authority offered, she paused and looked back at Prince Dorian with an expression that combined disappointment with something that might have been pity. "Your Highness," she said quietly, "I understand your position. You have no obligation to risk your safety for someone you met mere hours ago, someone whose claims you doubted and whose character you questioned." "Indeed, I do not," Prince Dorian replied with relief at her understanding, though something in her tone suggested that agreement was not the forgiveness he had hoped it might represent. "However," Evangeline continued with growing strength, "I find myself wondering what sort of kingdom we inhabit, if those with the power to protect the innocent choose safety and convenience over justice and courage when the moment of testing arrives." The observation struck Prince Dorian like a sword thrust to the heart, because it forced him to confront the comfortable cowardice that had characterized his entire approach to moral challenges. He had always chosen the path that preserved his own interests, while avoiding any risk that might threaten his comfort or position. "Lady Evangeline," the royal messenger said urgently, "we must depart now, if we are to reach the secret passages before Lord Thorne's men complete their encirclement." But Evangeline remained motionless, her sapphire eyes fixed upon Prince Dorian's face, as if she were reading the struggle between self-preservation and conscience that was playing out behind his carefully controlled expression. "Your Highness," she said with gentle precision that somehow made her words more devastating than any accusation, "you have spent this evening demonstrating that your courtesy and respect are determined entirely by people's power to retaliate against mistreatment. Now you have the opportunity to discover whether you possess any principles that transcend personal advantage." The challenge was delivered without heat or anger, but with the quiet authority of someone who had survived 18 months of persecution without losing her ability to distinguish between courage and cowardice in others. Prince Dorian felt something crack inside his chest as he recognized the fundamental choice she was presenting. He could maintain the comfortable cynicism that had governed his life, treating moral principles as luxuries that practical people could not afford, or he could discover whether he possessed the capacity for genuine nobility when tested by actual danger. "Captain Morrison," he said with sudden decision that surprised everyone present, including himself, "bar the gates and prepare the defenses. No armed force will be permitted to enter this castle without proper royal warrant, clearly establishing their authority." The command sent gasps of shock through the reception chamber as the assembled courtiers realized that Prince Dorian was choosing to resist Lord Thorne's agents, despite the personal and political risks such resistance entailed. "Your Highness," Lord Pemberton protested desperately. "Surely you cannot mean to defy what may be legitimate royal authority. If these men truly represent the crown, then they will possess proper documentation of their authority," Prince Dorian interrupted with growing conviction, "and they will conduct their business according to established legal procedures rather than armed intimidation." The distinction he drew was crucial. Legitimate royal agents would carry warrants and follow protocols, while Lord Thorne's men were operating as a private army, using claims of royal authority to justify actions that served criminal conspiracy. "Lady Evangeline," Prince Dorian continued, turning toward her with an expression that combined determination with something approaching humility, "if you are willing to remain under my protection, rather than departing with His Majesty's messenger, I give you my word that no harm will come to you while you shelter within these walls." The offer was simultaneously generous and dangerous. Generous because it represented personal risk undertaken for someone he had previously mistreated. Dangerous because it committed him to armed resistance against forces whose superior numbers might well overwhelm his defenses. Evangeline studied his face with careful attention, searching for signs of genuine transformation versus mere political calculation in his sudden change of position. "Your Highness," she said slowly, "what has changed between this moment and the beginning of our conversation? What makes you willing now to risk everything for someone whose very presence you found offensive just hours earlier?" The question demanded honest self-examination rather than comfortable platitudes, forcing Prince Dorian to articulate the moral awakening that Evangeline's courage and royal vindication had catalyzed within his previously cynical worldview. "What has changed," he said with careful honesty, "is my understanding of what nobility actually requires. I have spent my life believing that noble birth automatically conferred noble character. But you have shown me that true nobility lies in choices made when everything is at stake rather than privileges inherited at birth." The admission was simultaneously an apology for his earlier cruelty and a commitment to demonstrate the character transformation that genuine remorse could achieve when guided by courage rather than mere expedience. "Furthermore," he continued with growing strength, "I find that I am curious to discover whether I possess the capacity for honor when tested by genuine adversity rather than social convenience." Evangeline felt tears begin to flow as she recognized the authentic struggle toward moral growth that was occurring before her eyes. The man who had been prepared to cast her into the storm for his courtier's entertainment was choosing to risk everything to protect her from forces that posed genuine danger to his own safety and position. "Your Highness," she said with warmth that had been absent from her earlier responses, "I would be honored to remain under your protection, and I thank you for discovering the courage to choose justice over safety when the moment of testing arrived." But their conversation was interrupted by the crash of something heavy striking the castle's main gates, followed by shouted demands that grew increasingly threatening as Lord Thorne's agents realized that their intimidation was being met with organized resistance. "Prince Dorian!" the lead agent called with growing fury. "You have 1 minute to surrender the fugitive, or we will take her by force. Lord Thorne's authority supersedes your territorial claims." The ultimatum sent cold determination through Prince Dorian as he realized that the moment for half measures and diplomatic evasion had passed. He was now committed to armed resistance against forces that would show no mercy if they achieved victory. "Captain Morrison," he commanded with authority that rang through the castle, "signal the beacon towers. Alert every ally within riding distance that Blackmoor Castle stands under siege by forces claiming false royal authority." The decision to call for aid transformed the confrontation from private conflict to public challenge of Lord Thorne's conspiracy, ensuring that whatever happened tonight would have consequences extending far beyond Evangeline's individual fate. As the sound of approaching battle filled the air outside, Prince Dorian found himself standing beside the woman, whose courage had catalyzed his own moral awakening, facing enemies whose defeat would require him to prove that his transformation from cruel aristocrat to genuine protector was more than mere words spoken in momentary emotion. The test of whether comfortable cruelty could indeed be transformed into costly courage was about to begin. The siege of Blackmoor Castle began in earnest, as Lord Thorne's agents abandoned all pretense of legitimate authority in favor of direct assault upon walls that had stood against enemies for 3 centuries. The sound of grappling hooks striking stone and ladders being raised against the battlements echoed through the storm, while torches flared in the courtyard as defenders prepared for what might prove to be their final stand. Prince Dorian had transformed from elegant host to military commander with a speed that surprised everyone, including himself. His theoretical knowledge of castle defense, learned as part of his aristocratic education, was being tested by genuine combat for the first time in his privileged life. "Your Highness," Captain Morrison reported from his position coordinating the defense, "our scouts count 23 attackers with professional military equipment. They're moving with the precision of experienced soldiers, rather than common mercenaries." The observation confirmed that Lord Thorne's resources extended far beyond mere political influence into actual military capacity, suggesting that his conspiracy had prepared for armed resistance to their operations. Evangeline stood in the castle's great hall, no longer the desperate supplicant who had knelt before Prince Dorian hours earlier, but a woman whose royal vindication and the prince's protection had restored not just her status, but her confidence in speaking truth regardless of its reception. "Your Highness," she said as Prince Dorian paused between defensive preparations, "Lord Thorne's agents will not be content with my capture. They know that your resistance tonight marks you as an enemy to their conspiracy, which means your safety depends upon their complete defeat rather than mere repulsion." The strategic insight revealed that Evangeline's understanding of the forces arrayed against them extended beyond personal survival to encompass the broader political implications of the evening's confrontation. "You believe they intend to eliminate me as well as you?" Prince Dorian asked with interest rather than fear, his mind engaging with tactical problems rather than dwelling upon personal danger. "I believe Lord Thorne cannot afford to leave alive anyone who has witnessed his agents operating under false royal authority," Evangeline replied with precision that demonstrated her own intelligence and political acumen. "Dead heroes cannot testify about conspiracies, while living defenders become dangerous witnesses to treason." Prince Dorian nodded grimly as he recognized the truth of her analysis. By choosing to protect her, he had indeed committed himself to a fight that would end in either complete victory or death for everyone involved. "Then we shall ensure that our victory is complete," he said with conviction that surprised him with its depth. "Captain Morrison, what word from the beacon signals?" "Lord Harrison of Irondale has responded that he rides with 30 men," the captain reported with obvious relief. "Duke Aldrich of Westmarch signals that he dispatches 50 cavalry immediately. Your Highness's call for aid has been answered by every ally within reasonable distance." The prospect of reinforcement arriving within hours transformed the tactical situation from desperate defense to holding action that might indeed achieve the complete victory that survival required. But Lord Thorne's agents were not ignorant of the political implications of beacon signals and responding allies. Their leader's voice cut through the storm with new urgency as he realized that time favored the defenders rather than the attackers. "Prince Dorian," he called with barely controlled fury, "you have chosen to defy legitimate royal authority in favor of protecting known traitors. When Lord Thorne's influence reaches the king's ear, your lands and titles will be forfeit as payment for your treason." The threat revealed the full scope of Lord Thorne's political calculations. Even if his agents failed to capture Evangeline tonight, he expected his influence to ensure that Prince Dorian faced consequences for his resistance that would destroy him regardless of the immediate battle's outcome. "Your Highness," Evangeline said quietly, "Lord Thorne's agent speaks truth about his master's political influence. Even if we survive tonight, your protection of me may cost you everything you value in terms of position and power." The observation was delivered without plea or pressure, simply acknowledgement of the sacrifices that Prince Dorian's moral choice would require if he maintained his commitment to justice over political expedience. Prince Dorian considered her words carefully as he watched his men prepare defensive positions that might indeed preserve their lives while destroying his comfortable existence as a powerful prince whose word carried weight in royal councils. "Lady Evangeline," he said with quiet conviction that revealed the depth of his transformation, 18 months ago you lost everything, family, fortune, position, security, because you refused to abandon truth in favor of safety. Tonight, I discover whether I possess similar courage when faced with comparable choices." The parallel he drew between their circumstances revealed his understanding that moral courage required consistency regardless of changing fortunes, that principles meant nothing if they were abandoned when their cost became inconvenient. "Furthermore," he continued with growing strength, I find that the prospect of losing ill-gotten power troubles me less than the prospect of living with the knowledge that I abandoned justice when it required personal sacrifice. Evangeline felt her heart leap at hearing such words from the man who had been prepared to cast her into the storm for his guests' entertainment. The transformation was so complete that she hardly recognized the cruel prince who had dismissed her claims with such theatrical disdain. But their conversation was interrupted by the crash of something massive striking the castle's gates, followed by splintering wood that suggested Lord Thorne's agents had brought siege equipment sufficient to breach defenses that had withstood lesser assaults for generations. "Your Highness," Captain Morrison called urgently, "they're using a battering ram against the main gates. The portcullis will hold for perhaps an hour, but they're also scaling the walls on 3 sides." The multi-pronged assault revealed military expertise that confirmed these were indeed professional soldiers, rather than mere thugs hired for intimidation purposes. Prince Dorian drew his sword for the first time in actual combat, its weight unfamiliar in his hand, despite years of ceremonial training. "Then we shall meet them at every point, and demonstrate that justice, when properly defended, proves stronger than conspiracy supported by superior numbers." But even as he spoke these brave words, Prince Dorian wondered whether his theoretical courage would prove adequate when tested by steel and blood, rather than social pressure and political calculation. The sound of scaling ladders striking stone was followed by war cries as Lord Thorne's agents reached the battlements and engaged the castle's defenders in hand-to-hand combat. The academic question of whether Prince Dorian possessed genuine nobility was about to receive its most definitive answer. "Lady Evangeline," he said as he prepared to join the battle that would determine both their fates, "if I fall tonight, you must promise to survive and ensure that truth about Lord Thorne's conspiracy reaches the king, regardless of personal cost." "And if I fall," Evangeline replied with equal conviction, "you must promise to continue fighting for justice, even when those you protect lack the power to reward your courage." The mutual commitment to principles transcending personal survival revealed how completely their relationship had been transformed from persecutor and victim to partners in the defense of truth against conspiracy. As Prince Dorian moved toward the courtyard where battle had been joined, he carried with him not just sword and shield, but the knowledge that he was finally discovering what true nobility required when tested by genuine adversity. The cruel prince who had enjoyed humiliating the powerless was gone, replaced by someone willing to risk everything for justice, regardless of its cost to his comfort and position. But whether this transformation had occurred deeply enough to sustain him through actual combat remained to be proven by steel and courage rather than mere words spoken in moments of moral clarity. The courtyard of Blackmoor Castle had become a battlefield where the clash of steel rang out above the storm's fury, illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across scenes of desperate combat. Prince Dorian found himself fighting for his life against men whose professional skill made his ceremonial training seem woefully inadequate for actual warfare. The leader of Lord Thorne's agents, a scarred veteran whose competence spoke of countless similar operations, had reached the courtyard and was cutting through the castle's defenders with methodical precision. His goal was clearly the Great Hall, where Evangeline waited under the protection of the few guards Prince Dorian could spare from the walls. "Your Highness," Captain Morrison called desperately as he parried a blow that would have taken his head. "They're breaking through on the east wall. I can't hold this position much longer." Prince Dorian spun from his own opponent, a younger agent whose speed and strength were testing every skill he possessed, to assess the tactical situation that was rapidly deteriorating beyond their ability to control. Lord Thorne's men had indeed achieved what appeared to be inevitable victory through superior numbers and professional expertise. The castle's defenders, brave but outnumbered 2-1, were being systematically overwhelmed despite fighting for their lives, and Lord with admirable courage. "Fall back to the keep," Prince Dorian commanded, making the strategic decision to concentrate his remaining forces in a defensive position that might be held until reinforcements arrived. "Protect the inner doors at all costs." But even as he gave the order, Prince Dorian realized that retreat to the keep would leave Evangeline exposed in the Great Hall, vulnerable to capture by enemies whose arrival there now seemed inevitable. The moment of ultimate choice had arrived. He could preserve his own life by strategic withdrawal, or he could risk everything in a desperate attempt to reach Evangeline before Lord Thorne's agents achieved their primary objective. "Captain Morrison," he called as he made his decision, Take the men to the keep and hold it against all assault. Signal our allies that we need immediate relief. Your Highness, Morrison protested desperately. Where are you going? The hall is surrounded. To keep my word to someone who deserves protection more than I deserve survival, Prince Dorian replied with grim determination as he fought his way toward the great hall through combat that grew more desperate with each step. The philosophical transformation that had begun with Evangeline's courage in speaking truth, regardless of consequences, was reaching its ultimate test in Prince Dorian's willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that transcended personal safety. Inside the great hall, Evangeline had armed herself with an ornamental sword taken from the wall, its weight unfamiliar in her hands, but its presence somehow comforting as the sounds of approaching battle grew ever closer to her position. The doors burst open to admit 3 of Lord Thorne's agents, their weapons drawn and their faces reflecting the satisfaction of men who had finally cornered their prey after months of pursuit. Lady Evangeline Ashford, the lead agent announced with mock formality, you are commanded to surrender yourself for transport to Lord Thorne's custody, where you will answer for your father's crimes against the crown. My father committed no crimes, Evangeline replied with dignity that had survived 18 months of persecution and would not be broken by the threat of death itself. The only criminals in this matter are Lord Thorne and those who serve his conspiracy. Your father was a traitor, the agent continued with mechanical certainty, and you are a fugitive from justice whose capture will be rewarded rather than questioned by royal authority. The agent's confidence in his version of events revealed how thoroughly Lord Thorne's conspiracy had poisoned official channels with false information that made the victims appear as criminals, while the criminals claimed the authority of justice. Perhaps, Evangeline said with quiet courage as she raised the sword despite knowing her complete inexperience made resistance virtually futile, but I will not surrender to those who murdered my father and stole our lands through forgery and perjury. The 3 agents advanced with professional caution, clearly intending to take her alive for whatever purpose Lord Thorne had planned for her final disposition. But their advance was suddenly interrupted by the crash of the hall's rear entrance being smashed open by Prince Dorian, whose arrival was marked by determination that transcended his obvious exhaustion and multiple wounds from the fighting he had endured to reach her. Stand away from her, he commanded with authority that rang through the great hall despite his battered condition. Lady Evangeline is under my personal protection, and that protection will be honored while I draw breath. The lead agent turned toward Prince Dorian with the weary patience of a professional dealing with romantic foolishness that interfered with practical objectives. Your Highness, he said with false courtesy, you have fought bravely but futilely tonight. Surrender the woman, and Lord Thorne's mercy might extend to preserving your life despite your interference with legitimate operations. Lord Thorne's mercy, Prince Dorian replied with contempt that revealed how completely his understanding of the situation had clarified, is reserved for those who serve his criminal conspiracy. I choose to stand with justice, regardless of its cost. The philosophical choice he articulated was simultaneously personal and political. Personal because it represented his final rejection of the comfortable cynicism that had characterized his previous existence. Political because it aligned him publicly with royal authority against treasonous conspiracy. Then you choose to die for someone whose fate was sealed months ago, the agent said with finality as he signaled his companions to attack both defenders simultaneously. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. Prince Dorian's ceremonial training proved adequate to dispatch one agent through surprise and determination, but left him badly wounded and facing 2 opponents whose professional skill far exceeded his own. Evangeline's inexperience with weapons was overcome by desperate courage as she managed to wound one attacker, but her success left her vulnerable to retaliation that would certainly prove fatal. The moment when both defenders faced overwhelming odds was precisely when the Great Hall's main doors exploded inward to admit a force that transformed the entire tactical situation. King Frederick himself strode into the hall at the head of his personal guard, his presence immediately commanding attention from every person present. Behind him followed the royal messenger, who had departed earlier, accompanied by a full company of elite soldiers whose loyalty to the crown was absolute and unquestioned. Lord Thorne's agents, the king announced with authority that made lesser voices seem like whispers. You are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, murder, and armed rebellion against royal authority. Surrender immediately, or face the consequences of continued resistance. The surviving agents looked around desperately as they realized that their carefully planned operation had become a trap that caught them rather than their intended prey. "Your Majesty," the lead agent attempted desperately, "we were conducting legitimate operations under Lord Thorne's authority. Lord Thorne possesses no authority to authorize armed assault upon my nobles," King Frederick interrupted with cold finality. "His crimes have been fully exposed, his assets seized, and his co-conspirators identified for prosecution." The king's attention turned to Prince Dorian and Evangeline, both wounded, but standing together in defiance of forces that had sought to destroy them. "Your Highness," the king said with warmth that surprised everyone present, "your defense of Lady Evangeline tonight has demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and principle that true nobility requires. You have our gratitude and respect." Prince Dorian felt his knees weaken with relief as royal approval validated his transformation from cruel aristocrat to genuine protector, while Evangeline's vindication was finally complete through the highest possible authority. "Furthermore," King Frederick continued, "your beacon signals have served not just to summon aid, but to expose the full extent of Lord Thorne's conspiracy. Every ally who responded tonight has provided information about similar attacks upon noble families, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic treason. The revelation that their desperate defense had catalyzed the exposure of the entire conspiracy transformed their personal survival into historical significance that would protect countless others from similar persecution." As the surviving agents were led away in chains and the immediate danger passed, Prince Dorian and Evangeline found themselves face to face with the knowledge that their ordeal had forged something stronger than either had dared hope possible. The cruel prince who had prepared to cast her into the storm had become a man willing to die for justice, while the desperate fugitive had become someone whose courage had inspired that transformation. 6 months after the night that had transformed cruelty into courage and persecution into protection, Princess Evangeline Blackmore stood in the restored gardens of Ashford Manor, watching as workmen completed the final touches on the monument that would commemorate her father's vindication and the defeat of Lord Thorne's conspiracy. The estate that had been stolen through forged documents and fabricated charges had been restored to her ownership, along with full compensation for the suffering she had endured during her 18 months of exile. But more meaningful than material restoration was the knowledge that her father's honor had been publicly vindicated before all who had believed the lies that destroyed him. Prince Dorian, now her husband of 3 months, approached through paths lined with roses that had been replanted to match her mother's original garden design. The man who had once derived pleasure from humiliating those he perceived as powerless had become someone whose greatest satisfaction came from using his influence to protect the vulnerable and advance justice. "My beloved," he said with the warmth that had completely replaced his former cruel amusement, "the final reports from the trials have arrived. Every member of Lord Thorne's conspiracy has been convicted, and the assets seized from their criminal operations will fund compensation for all families they targeted." The comprehensive victory over the conspiracy that had destroyed so many innocent lives represented more than personal vindication. It had become the foundation for systematic reforms that would prevent similar persecution in the future. "Furthermore," Prince Dorian continued, "King Frederick has approved our proposal for the Ashford protections, legal safeguards that will make it impossible for anyone to face the ordeal you endured without immediate royal investigation. The legislation that bore her family name would ensure that accusations of treason against noble families would trigger automatic oversight designed to prevent the kind of systematic frame that had been used against her father and so many others." Evangeline smiled as she accepted the documents that represented transformation of her personal suffering into protections that would benefit countless others. The child who lost everything because of one man's greed will live to see legal guarantees that such loss becomes impossible for future victims. And the prince who nearly facilitated that loss through his own moral blindness has learned to see justice as more important than comfort, Prince Dorian added, with the humility that had replaced his former arrogance. "Though I confess, I still struggle to understand how you found it possible to forgive someone who treated you with such cruelty." The question that had become a gentle ritual between them reflected his continuing amazement at her capacity for mercy, despite the suffering his initial rejection had nearly caused. "Because," Evangeline replied, with the wisdom born of surviving adversity without becoming corrupted by it, Your cruelty that night was based on ignorance and prejudice rather than evil intent. When truth replaced ignorance and justice overcame prejudice, you became someone entirely different. Moreover, she continued with growing warmth, you chose to risk everything to protect me once you understood the truth, proving that your capacity for nobility had merely been hidden beneath comfortable cynicism rather than destroyed by it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Morrison, whose loyalty during the siege had earned him promotion to head of the castle guard, and whose friendship had become one of the unexpected benefits of their shared ordeal. Your Highnesses, he announced with obvious satisfaction, the delegation from Parliament has arrived to present the formal recognition of your service to Crown and Kingdom. The parliamentary recognition represented official acknowledgement that their defense of truth against conspiracy had served interests far beyond their personal circumstances, contributing to national security through exposure of treasonous networks. As they walked toward the castle where distinguished visitors awaited, Evangeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate supplicant to respected princess, whose voice carried weight in matters of justice and legal reform. King Frederick himself had traveled from the capital to present honors that would mark their story as an example of courage, triumphing over conspiracy, and love growing from the ashes of persecution. Princess Evangeline, Prince Dorian, the king said warmly as they entered the great hall where their ordeal had begun, with such different expectations, you have demonstrated that individual courage, when properly applied, can indeed defeat systematic evil regardless of its apparent power. The king's attention turned to the assembled parliamentary delegation, whose presence indicated the broader significance of the reforms that had grown from their personal experience. Furthermore, His Majesty continued, your example has inspired comprehensive examination of how noble families can be protected from false accusations while ensuring that genuine criminals cannot escape justice through claims of persecution. The balance between protection and accountability that their case had helped define would influence legal development for generations, ensuring that the innocent received safeguards without creating immunity for the guilty. Your Majesty, Evangeline said with the confidence that royal vindication and marriage had restored, our greatest satisfaction lies not in personal happiness, though that has exceeded our dreams, but in knowing that others will never face the isolation and terror that systematic persecution creates. Indeed, Prince Dorian added, we have learned that true nobility lies not in inherited privilege, but in willingness to sacrifice comfort for justice when the moment of testing arrives. The philosophical insight they shared reflected the moral education that their ordeal had provided, transforming both persecutor and victim into advocates for principles that transcended their personal interests. As the ceremony continued, with formal presentations and official recognition of their contributions to justice and security, Evangeline found herself thinking not of past suffering, but of future possibilities created by their survival and growth. The estate that had been stolen was now restored, but more importantly, it had become the headquarters for legal advocacy that would protect other vulnerable families from similar persecution. The marriage that had grown from initial cruelty had become a partnership dedicated to ensuring that power served justice rather than personal convenience. My love, Prince Dorian said quietly as they stood together receiving congratulations from delegates who had once viewed them as examples of romantic foolishness, but now recognized them as pioneers of progressive justice. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I had chosen safety over courage that night? Every day, Evangeline replied honestly, and every day I am grateful that you discovered the strength to choose correctly when everything depended upon that choice. You gave me the opportunity to become someone worthy of your forgiveness, Prince Dorian observed with deep contentment, the greatest gift anyone has ever received. As the evening progressed with celebrations that honored their individual courage and mutual love, Evangeline reflected on the strange justice of their story. The night that had begun with Prince Dorian's cruel intention to humiliate someone he viewed as a presumptuous impostor had ended with his willingness to die protecting her from forces that represented actual evil. Most remarkably, the transformation had proven permanent rather than momentary. 6 months of marriage had only deepened Prince Dorian's commitment to justice and strengthened his character, as if confronting his own capacity for cruelty had freed him to develop virtues he had never known he possessed. The woman who knelt before you that night would hardly recognize the princess who stands here now. Prince Dorian observed, as they watched parliamentary delegates examine the legal protections that would bear their names. And the prince who prepared to cast her into the storm would be amazed by the king whose greatest pleasure comes from protecting others rather than persecuting them, Evangeline replied, with a smile that encompassed not just personal happiness, but deep satisfaction with the changes they had wrought together. Through the great hall's windows, they could see lights beginning to twinkle in the village, where their foundation provided support for families facing legal persecution, education for children whose parents had been falsely accused, and advocacy for anyone struggling against false charges or systematic intimidation. The suffering that had nearly destroyed them both had become the foundation for protection that would outlive them, ensuring that their personal victory would multiply into countless others for people who would never know their names, but whose lives would be safer because of choices made during one terrible but transformative night. In the great hall where it all began, surrounded by evidence of changes that would extend across generations, the former persecutor and his victim had created something far more powerful than personal happiness. They had proven that individual courage could indeed reshape the world when guided by love and sustained by principle. The cruelest prince had become the most just king, while the most desperate fugitive had become the most effective advocate for those who still lacked protection. Together, they continued their quiet revolution, one law, one life, one act of justice at a time. 15 years after the storm that had nearly claimed her life, but instead delivered her to salvation, Queen Evangeline Blackmore stood on the balcony of Ashford Palace, watching as representatives from across Europe gathered in the courtyard below for the signing of the International Covenant on Noble Protection, legislation that had grown from her personal ordeal into a comprehensive framework safeguarding aristocratic families against the kind of conspiracy that had once destroyed her own. The transformation from desperate fugitive to respected queen, whose voice influenced policy across multiple kingdoms, still seemed impossible when she contemplated the journey that had brought her to this moment of historical significance. King Dorian, whose transformation from cruel prince to champion of justice had become legendary in diplomatic circles, joined her on the balcony with their 12-year-old son, Prince William, whose education had been carefully designed to ensure he understood that power served justice rather than personal convenience. "Mother," Prince William said with the earnest attention characteristic of children raised to understand that their privileges carried corresponding obligations, "Professor Matthews says that the laws you and father created have prevented over 300 families from losing their estates to false accusations. Is that really true?" Evangeline smiled at their son, whose character reflected the principles she and Dorian had fought to establish during their early years together. "It's true, my dear, but remember that those protections exist because many people chose courage over comfort when tested by difficult circumstances. Like father chose to protect you instead of sending you away that night during the storm?" William asked, with the clarity that only children brought to complex moral questions. "Exactly like that," Dorian confirmed, settling beside his son with the patience that had completely replaced his former cruelty. "Though I should add that your mother's courage in speaking truth, despite knowing it might not be believed, was equally important to everything that followed. The mutual recognition of each other's contributions had become the foundation of their marriage and their partnership in advancing justice. Acknowledgement that transformation required both willingness to change and willingness to forgive, both courage to confront wrong and mercy to allow growth." Below in the courtyard, King Frederick, now in his 70s but still actively supporting the reforms his intervention had made possible, was greeting the foreign delegates whose presence testified to the international influence their story had achieved. "Furthermore," Dorian continued, addressing their son's education in the realities of power and responsibility, "the most important lesson is that being born to privilege means nothing unless that privilege is used to protect those who lack similar advantages. Professor Matthews told us about Lord Thorne and how he hurt innocent families to steal their land," William said, with the serious expression of a child grappling with adult concepts of evil and justice. "Will people like him always exist, or can they be stopped permanently?" The question reflected the kind of moral sophistication that Evangeline and Dorian had worked to cultivate in their son, understanding that evil existed while maintaining hope that it could be defeated through systematic effort and principled resistance. "People like Lord Thorne will probably always exist," Evangeline said honestly, But each generation can make it harder for them to succeed and easier for their victims to find protection and justice. That's why the laws we've created are so important, Dorian added. They don't prevent evil from existing, but they provide tools for fighting it that previous generations didn't possess. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Morrison, now General Morrison, and head of the Royal Guard, whose friendship had remained constant through 15 years of shared service to the Crown and dedication to protecting the innocent. "Your Majesties," he announced with obvious satisfaction, "the final signatures have been obtained. Every major power in Europe has now committed to the protection protocols that make systematic persecution legally impossible under international law. The achievement represented the culmination of 15 years of patient diplomacy and persistent advocacy, transforming individual survival into collective security for vulnerable populations across multiple kingdoms. Moreover," General Morrison continued, "the Enforcement Tribunal has been fully established and staffed with judges whose integrity has been verified through the most rigorous investigation. The protection your personal experience made possible now extends to families across the civilized world." Evangeline felt tears begin to flow as she contemplated the extraordinary scope of what had grown from her desperate attempt to seek justice for her murdered father. The young woman who had knelt before Prince Dorian, begging him to believe her claims, had lived to see those claims validated and transformed into protections for countless others. "There is additional news," General Morrison announced, "that particularly relates to your family's legacy. The Ashford Foundation has been granted royal charter as a permanent institution with endowments sufficient to continue its work indefinitely." The foundation that bore her family name had grown from compensation for personal suffering into an international organization providing legal advocacy, financial support, and systematic protection for anyone facing the kind of persecution that had once seemed insurmountable. As the afternoon ceremony began, bringing together survivors of political persecution alongside the monarchs, diplomats, and legal scholars who had worked to transform individual suffering into collective protection, Evangeline reflected on the remarkable justice of their story. King Frederick, officiating at his final major ceremony before transferring authority to Dorian as his chosen successor, spoke words that would be remembered as defining the new era of international cooperation they had helped to establish. "This covenant represents more than legal protection for noble families," His Majesty declared to the assembled delegates. "It embodies the principle that individual courage, when properly supported and systematically applied, can indeed overcome the most sophisticated evil." The ceremony continued with formal presentations and official recognition of the countless individuals whose contributions had advanced the cause of justice, but Evangeline found her attention drawn to personal rather than public significance. The ballroom where she had first knelt in desperation now hosted celebrations that honored the transformation of her suffering into salvation for others. The prince who had prepared to cast her into the storm had become a king whose greatest achievement was ensuring that no one else would face similar abandonment. "My beloved," Dorian said softly as they watched their son William interact effortlessly with young people from families that had been protected by the laws they had created, "do you realize that our children will grow up in a world where the kind of systematic persecution we fought to overcome has been made not just illegal but practically impossible?" "More importantly," Evangeline replied, "they will grow up understanding that their advantages exist to serve others rather than themselves, that nobility lies in character rather than birth, and that the greatest achievement is not personal happiness but knowledge that one's life has made others safer." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of an elderly woman whose presence sent ripples of recognition through the assembled crowd. Lady Catherine Whitmore, the former court lady whose cruel mockery had once added to Evangeline's humiliation, now approached with obvious humility and what appeared to be genuine contrition. "Your Majesty," Lady Whitmore said with difficulty that spoke of years spent contemplating her own capacity for cruelty when it seemed safe and profitable, "I wanted to thank you for the mercy you showed in not pursuing consequences for those of us who participated in your persecution that terrible night." The acknowledgement of past wrongs from someone who had enjoyed Evangeline's suffering demonstrated the moral education that their story had provided for everyone who witnessed it. "Lady Whitmore," Evangeline replied with the grace that had enabled her to transform suffering into service rather than bitterness, "your recognition of past errors and your support for the protections we've created represents exactly the kind of growth that makes systemic change possible. Furthermore, she continued with warmth that surprised the older woman, your willingness to confront your own capacity for cruelty when it seemed advantageous has helped educate others about the importance of choosing compassion over convenience regardless of social pressure. The forgiveness that Evangeline offered was not mere personal generosity, but recognition that lasting reform required transformation of hearts as well as laws, that individuals capable of growth should be encouraged rather than permanently condemned for past failures. As the evening progressed with celebrations that honored both personal courage and systematic reform, Evangeline felt the deep satisfaction of someone whose survival had been transformed into salvation for countless others. The storm that had nearly destroyed her had instead become the catalyst for changes that would protect vulnerable families across multiple generations. The prince who had prepared to abandon her to death had become a king whose life was dedicated to ensuring such abandonment became impossible. Most remarkably, their love had grown not despite their initial circumstances, but because of them, proving that relationships built upon mutual recognition of each other's capacity for growth could transcend any obstacles that mere social convention might create. In the palace where their story had begun with such different intentions, surrounded by evidence of changes that would extend across continents and generations, the former fugitive and the reformed prince had completed their quiet revolution. The cruelest aristocrat had become the most just ruler, while the most desperate victim had become the most effective protector of other victims. Together, they had proven that individual choices made in moments of crisis could indeed reshape the world when guided by principle and sustained by love. The woman who had been thrown into the storm to die had returned as a queen whose mercy would protect countless others from facing similar storms. The transformation was complete, the justice was served, and the future was secured for generations yet unborn. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.